Despite calls from the government over the weekend for people to stay at home, thousands of people joined protests across the country in support of the Black Lives Matter movement following the death of George Floyd.
Well, as the protests intensify and solidarity continues to unite people across the globe, former NBA basketballer and psychologist John Amaechi says it's time to make a stand and actively do our bit to fight racism. Good morning, John.
Morning,
Thank
John.
you for joining us today.
Morning, both.
Your reaction to that brutal video that we all watched?
I think it's hard, perhaps, for white people to conceptualize what it's like to watch someone murdered because they look like you. It's incredible to watch the life suffocated out of somebody by the authorities with, ironically, on the side of their car painted "Protect and Serve." And not only the one officer that suffocated that man to death and murdered him, but the other two who watched. And I think we always expect the face of evil to be one of real purpose. And I think the reason that this particular incident has resonated so strongly with allies and Black people around the world is because his face was so apathetic. It wasn't that he was determined somehow to murder. It was just that murder would be incidental. It's just been an incredibly painful and exhausting experience, I think, for a lot of Black people.
So you can understand the reaction globally to this and the protests that we've seen here overnight, especially in London. A lot of people are saying, though, unfortunately, at the same time as this, there is a global pandemic. Was it right for people to continue those protests with this in mind?
Yeah, I struggle with this. I am a public health official. I'm a director in the NHS. I have 20-odd thousand staff and colleagues at my hospitals, and I don't want to put any more pressure on them than I need to. But at the same time, we have been waiting a long time to see this kind of resonant anger that seeps outside of the core of the Black community. It seeps outside of the core of the African-American community in America and beyond the borders of America and Europe. We've needed this because we are not without pain in this country. We are not without issues of bias and racism in this country. It may often be dressed up in far more sophisticated and pretty language. But we have also got incidents that we can look back. Grenfell Tower differentially impacted Black and brown people. We can look at the Windrush scandal. All of these things are our sins that we need to amend. And so it's not surprising that people want to protest. All I would say is, please protect yourselves, wear PPE. The very people who will be at these marches are those most at risk of COVID.
You seem to, whenever you post anything online or anybody uses the hashtag Black Lives Matter, automatic within a heartbeat, suddenly everybody's saying all lives matter, all lives matter. Can you just, head in hands, can you just explain that and why it's different?
Yes, it is hard to believe that people imagine that because you are pointing out that one person is wounded, that if everybody else was wounded, we wouldn't care for them. Black Lives Matter is like triage. You have to consider that everybody's got some kind of pain, but at the moment, the most crucial one is the Black Lives Matter cause at this moment. If you were watching children play in a park and one of them fell over and bumped their knee and they're bleeding, and then you went to attend to that child and people focused on that child and tried to comfort that child and somebody applied a plaster to that child. If somebody came along and said, well, what about that child over there? But that child hasn't got a wound right now. So it's not a question of Black lives being more important. It's just that if you look around the world, if you look at the treatment at the hands of police in America and beyond, it's very clear that Black lives matter a fraction of a white life. And that's what we're trying to amend. We're not trying to make anybody else uncared for. We're just trying to make sure that the care is equally distributed.
Do you think that, for me, there has, I perceive some sort of change here? We have discussed this in our family more this week than ever before. And it's a subject that we have discussed many times, but my daughters have been reading literature, not just 2 or 3 times, but constantly. They're reading papers, they're reading information, they're discussing it. We are all discussing it as a family.
With my 5-year-old this weekend, so I thought, right.
So something looks like it's taken root here at last.
I think conversations are really important. The problem is that rhetoric rarely saves lives in the moment. I think what we need to do is move from that to action. And don't mistake me. These conversations are essential. Educating ourselves is essential. Not relying on Black people to educate the entire population is also essential. So that proactivity is important. But the problem for me is that I remember Sandra Bland. I remember Ferguson. I remember 1991, Rodney King. And after each of those incidents, I remember me or people like me talking to people like you and saying, this is the beginning of a new era. And every time I say cautiously, yes, I hope so. If we turn rhetoric into action, if we make sure that we are the custodians of the kind of inclusive culture that we want, that each of us does the really boring stuff that nobody will tweet or like. We look in our exact environment and we say, this is the standard of anti-racism, not just not being racist, but anti-racism that I will hold myself to. And I will demand that everybody in my sphere of influence, some of us will have large sphere of influences like you guys who can influence millions of people, and some of us will just have a couple of family members. But we will make sure that we educate and that we make sure that our environment is one that is anti-racist. If we do that, then yes, this can be a tipping point. If we stay as interested as the media will, and as that declines over the next couple of weeks because more important things come along, then once again, we'll be able to reflect on this the next time and wonder if the next time
What about schools here? Because the Black history we learn here is limited. Does this start with education? Does this need to be in our school system?
No child is born racist.
This is very true. No child is born racist. So the good news, you're absolutely right. Racism is learned. But what we know is that by the time a child is roughly the age of 5, they've got a pretty good indication that Black is bad and that Black is ugly. And we've seen this study since the doll study, the doll research that was done in, I think, 1940. We've known this. So our education has to really integrate to make sure that we're not just having a month or a week where we're talking about Black people, because that makes it seem like an add-on. It makes it seem like this is something, an elective, that you can learn about if you choose. But better, we understand the integration and the essential nature of Black people. If nothing else, we have the Windrush era, where Black people were asked to come to this country to help rebuild after the war. And the truth is, if we learnt about that, perhaps we would look differently upon the Black and brown people, especially the older generation that exist here now, knowing that we invited them and that they helped rebuild the country does change your perspective, rather than, as most people, when they see me, run away.
Is that true? Just explain that, if you wouldn't mind.
The running away part?
Yeah, just the experiences you've had.
I'm a 6'9" Black man. I'm essentially the dictionary definition of a super predator. And so the fact that I am also a psychologist and somewhat clever on my good days doesn't really come across when I'm walking down the street. When I walk down the street, people cross the street away from me. If it's dark, I know that I'm going to be the kind of person that will frighten people, and there's nothing I can do about it. I told somebody the other day, I have a collection of credit cards that I have to hand in on a regular basis, because when I stand behind somebody at a cash machine, they peek over their shoulder and they see me and they go, cancel, 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 cancel. And when that card won't come out fast enough, they just abandon it because a psychologist is stood behind them. And that somehow is terrifying.
And how does that feel? Sorry, how does that feel to you? When that happens, you go, here we go again. What does that feel like?
That is the thing I would love people to understand is that I am the most privileged of Black people. I don't suffer anything like most of my Black and brown brothers and sisters. But it just makes it clear every day that how many of your listeners think about what they wear when they leave the house, walk in the rain and realize if they put their hoodie up, there's a greater chance that they'll be stopped and searched. How many people watch as you get into a lift with somebody and the men put their hand over their wallet and the women take their bag from the shoulder closest to you to the shoulder that's further away? This is every day.
Can you explain your T-shirt, John?
Oh, Rosa Parks. Yes. My sister bought this for me actually several years ago, but which is why it barely fits. But it's just the Rosa Parks was was the woman in America. Well, she's the woman in America who, amongst many others, but she was lauded as the person who wouldn't sit at the back of the bus. Nah, I'm not going to sit at the back of the bus. And we are in that moment now where many Black people and their allies realize that nobody should have to sit in the back of the bus in terms of our society. The thing that I hope people know is that racism is not going to make the lives of white people, ending racism is not going to make the lives of white people worse. Ending racism, wherever it's been attempted and any measure of success has happened, has made the lives of everybody better.
Can I just ask you finally about the statue of the slave trader Edward Colston being pulled down in Bristol yesterday and being thrown into the harbour?
Yeah. I find it convenient that people are able to separate so clearly, as long as there's 100 years or so between the time of their existence and now, they're able to separate so clearly between the misdeeds of a person and their contributions. I find it intriguing that nobody's calling for a statue of Jimmy Savile, despite what he did for charity, because they know that you can't separate out a serial predator from his gifts.
And so was the statue, was it right that it ended up in the harbour?
I would have preferred a recycling option.
And what about the defacing of Winston Churchill's monument in Parliament Square?
I broadly think public vandalism is a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing to have a conversation about whether people we laud as perfection have flaws. And I think the more that we can point out that some of the flawed thinking, the flawed acts and activities of famous people who we universally laud, the better, the more nuanced the discussion around what a great leadership can and should be, can be.
Thank you, John.
John, thank
you very much.
It's really great to talk to you today.